Yeah. So a little bit about this week. As I talked about last week, we're going to be focusing this week on talking about the kind of biology side of things. So we've been contrasting social construction and social approaches to gender and sex with biological approaches, but we haven't really talked too much about biological determinism. And we're going to do that today. So this lecture is entitled The Cultural Manifestations of Biological Determinism, and it's going to try to highlight both some of the kind of ways of thinking within the biological world or medical world that have been used to harm and marginalize different groups of people. It's also going to be challenging some of the biologically determinist approaches to binary sex and gender as a way of introducing you to the readings for this week. And then we're going to talk about how all this kind of operates in a cultural way, right? So how something like biology or the medical field is seen as kind of being this neutral arbiter of truth, right? But is actually these involves institutions that are very actively involved in the production of culture that can have gendered effects. So before I get into the lecture, kind of looking ahead to next week. Next week we have our first reading reflection due on Thursday, so that's 9 days from today. What this means is this week on Thursday, in 2 days, I'm going to be spending a bit of the Thursday class doing a writing workshop. So essentially what I'm going to be doing is writing a reading reflection in front of you all up on the screen, and hopefully getting it done in about 20 or 30 minutes, which will be completely unrealistic for any of you, and if you're only spending 30 minutes on these, you should be spending a lot more time than that, but I'm going to kind of come prepared to be able to write one quickly, and you'll understand the way I think about formatting, both in terms of like margin, spacing, and stuff like that, but also in terms of, where you put your main points, how you organize them, and how you write a really good reading reflection. So I recommend that everybody be here on Thursday. I will also post probably between now and Thursday materials that relate to the reading reflections that are very, very detailed in terms of tips for writing, requirements, etc. I try and make the writing assignments, the reading reflections, and the final paper all structured in such a way where if you just hit kind of the minimum requirements in terms of structure, content, and formatting, then you're guaranteed a B, right? So I treat like a B as kind of a C, so to speak, in terms of the minimum requirements. And I'll also help you think about what you need to exceed, or how you can exceed those requirements for those of you who want to get a jump start on getting an A in the class. So that's what we're going to be doing on Thursday. So I really recommend that everybody be here because that'll be a really important and useful lesson. So before I get started, are there any questions about the course, about the pace, about the content? No? Okay. This past week I had 2 different students email me just like random things that they came across like through various social media or friends or stuff like that they thought just related to the course. So it made me really happy to see that people are kind of thinking about the course and sending me stuff like that. So to get started, we're going to start by revisiting social construction really quickly. So the lecture from last week defined social construction, or talked about social construction in this way, right? We said that central to this course is the idea that identities are socially constructed as different meanings are strung together and attached to different bodies, vary over time and location, and are subject to constant change, or what we might call reconstruction. And these are all important aspects of the social constructionist approach, right? So first off, that different meanings are strung together and attached to particular bodies, right? So thinking in terms of gender and the gendered stereotype that women are supposed to be physically weak and men are supposed to be physically strong, right? So instead of thinking of women's and men's biology as just causing these things naturally and automatically, the social constructionist approach would say that, well, no, we come into a world where these meanings already exist, and so that women are already discouraged from becoming physically stronger, and men are already encouraged to become physically stronger. So it ends up becoming a socially based, self-fulfilling phenomena rather than an actually biologically determined thing, right? It's important in the social constructionist approach that we think about how they vary over time and are subject to change, right? Because if things are biologically determined, and the biological basis of the human, right, we're talking about our genetics, right? How cells work, basic biology. If that isn't changing, right, then we would assume that that means gender isn't changing, right? Or that gender can't change because it's caused by biology, and biology doesn't change. But as we know all too well, gender changes over time, it changes over location. What was considered attractive for women, 200 years ago would not be considered attractive for women today, right? So these things are subject to change. This is all important to the social constructionist approach, right? Therefore, when you're doing your work for this class and you're thinking from a social constructionist perspective, right, you don't want to think to yourself, what is male or what is female, but you want to think to yourself, how do things become male and female through different cultural practices? So we contrast this biological approach with the social approach. And in this class, rather than seeing identities as biological, we really want to stress that we see them as social. But just because things are social doesn't mean that biology isn't important. And in fact, as this lecture is going to talk about a lot, biology and biological traits are really, really important to help us understand, or an important part of how we understand identity, and also an important part of how identity affects us, right? Because we still do have bodies, and those bodies are important, right? Because of how our bodies are built, because of how they're put together, we experience the world differently, right? So to put it in a different way, it's fair to say that how two men experience the world is affected by things like their body type, by their skin tone, right? Whether or not they're fit, whether or not they're considered overweight, all these sorts of things, right? So social constructionist approaches to identity, right? And in particular gender, but we could talk about race, we could talk about sexuality. The social constructionist approach contrasts with what I've been using and calling a biological determinist approach, right? So this is kind of your first key term for this lecture. And biological determinism refers to when you assign biology determinative power over social identities like race, sex, gender, sexuality, and others. So it might already be a bit obvious, but can anybody try and describe what they think this phrase means? Determinative power. So, yeah.
Maybe the ways in which you describe certain rules that happen, certain biological processes. I remember reading an article back in my freshman year about how even when writing about the sperm and the egg had a passive role while the sperm was attacking it, and it was the ways in which language was used to assert roles about what a male sperm and female egg.
Yeah, I think you're kind of getting at it. You're kind of talking about it. So, is a particular way of approaching biology and assigning biology the power. I mean, we could kind of play with this phrase and say the power to determine something, right? So, for example, when we think about how genetics work, has anybody taken that biology 101 class where we talk about gene coding and you talk about all these sorts of, what are they? What are the four letters? There's adenine,
guanine, thymine, and cytosine.
Right. So you have these four compounds. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a scientist here, right? Right. And when combined in sets of three, I believe. Am I right here?
Two.
Right. What?
They're pairs.
Okay.
But if you're talking about protons, proteins.
Proteins. It's coding in sets of three, right?
Yes, in sets of three.
So essentially, from a biological perspective, if you have these particular substances, adenine, guanine.
Adenine, guanine.
Okay, right? If you have these in a particular order, that's going to give you blue eyes, right? And as long as they exist in this particular order, that's going to give you blue eyes. So do folks who have taken Biology 100 kind of remember this, right? And essentially, they talked about it as being kind of this zipping together of DNA strands, right? So if they're put together in this particular way and zipped up, then that tells, what tells proteins to go through particular processes to build your body in a certain way, right? This is terrible science, right? Don't pay attention to this science part, right? But essentially what it tells us is if this goes in this combination, then it's going to give us this thing, right? You can think of it like computer coding, right? If you type in this code in this particular way, then that code is going to work the same way every single time, right? And that's what biological determinism has to do, right? But while nobody in gender studies would argue that our idea of eye color is socially constructed, right? It's not like people in gender and women's studies are saying, like, blue eyes are only considered blue because of the social world we live in. It's like, no, blue eyes are blue eyes, right? And they're caused by what they're caused by. But something like gender might be something more. And when you think about, even back to that biology lesson around coding of DNA, you will remember that there's occasionally sort of irregularities, right, that cause things to be coded in different ways. And as we're going to talk about, a lot of kind of the history of medical and biological science around gender tries to ignore these things that don't fit into the kind of binary approach around biological sex. So biological determinism begins by using biological indicators. And these are just a few: chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, skin tone, facial structure, hair type, right? These are biological indicators that are used, this is just a few of them, that are used to base social identities on, right? So, and I'm going to work through kind of how this works around race in a tiny bit, but I'll give you an example of that right now. So, what makes a person a black person? What? Their skin tone, all right? So let's start there, right? So you would say that, I'm extrapolating from what you said here, that what defines or makes a person a black person is a darker skin tone, right? But would you agree that there's people who are considered Latina, Latino, Chicano, who have darker skin than other people who would be considered black? So it's not just skin, right? So what else is it then? Hair.
The way, like, facial features.
Okay, and I would say the same thing about these, right? Are there people who have hair that might be associated with black people but aren't considered black, right, racially? Are there people who have facial structures that would be considered, similar to facial structure associated with black people but aren't considered to be black, right? You have all of these exceptions. For every sort of biological indicator I would pick to construct race, right, you have all of these exceptions. But that's what social construction is, right? It's this process by which we take kind of a set of different kind of biological indicators and loosely string them together, even though there's all of these exceptions to these categories, right? So for example, I'm sure many of you already know, but some might not, there is no like genetic basis for race, right? In as much as there's no gene for black, right? There's no gene for white. There's sets of tons of different genes that create tons of different traits that we as a society kind of mush together and call these identity categories. But if you were to ask somebody who's a geneticist to look at your DNA and say for sure what your race is, they couldn't do it, right? You have these companies like 23andMe, I think, right, that do what they call these DNA profiles, right? Which, I mean, are hilarious because you see all these people come out of the woodwork and, like, all of a sudden it's like, I've decided I'm, I just realized I'm this, so, like, I'm going full-blown into that. Like, I'm gonna reconnect with those sorts of roots, and it's like 2%, or something like that. So it's because these tests look at a whole range of traits, right? And they essentially try and interpret these collections of traits the way that society interprets them into racial categories, right? So 23andMe looks at your DNA, right? And we'll look and see, okay, well, these 4 letters came together in these ways, so this person almost definitely has this sort of a skin tone, this sort of a nose shape, this sort of a facial structure. And based off of that, we're going to guesstimate that you are probably 38% this, 23% this, so on and so forth, right? That's how those things work. There is no single gene for any racial category, right? Just as there's no gene for gender, right? So the way gender biological determinism around gender works is it starts by looking at these 3, right? Chromosomes, hormones, and genitalia as indicators that tell us something about social identities, right? So we take these biological indicators and use them to define social identities. And we do that for everything, right? We do it for racial determination. We do it for gender determination, right? And the easiest example would be this kind of racial construction approach. And this is used a lot, this term racial construction, across the social sciences and humanities. And was originally kind of developed by two political scientists, Michael Omi and Howard Winant, in the late 1900s, and they kind of outlined the way this process works. This is the process that I just walked you through, where racial construction takes skin tone, takes facial structure, takes hair type, takes all these different things, and kind of decides, right, through various social processes, that if these traits all appear together, right, in the right way, then you qualify as this particular racial group, right? And this is where the notion of passing originated from, right? When we talk about passing, being able to pass as something, the term passing started in race and ethnic studies by scholars who were looking at people who were essentially able to pass as white, right, or pass as a race other than they were, and looked at the sort of power or social benefits that they were able to reap from that, right? So to draw some conclusions out of this, first off, the biology-based approach cannot explain the persistent differences within groups and similarities between groups, right? So as we walk through this racial construction thing, and you started with skin tone, and then you included hair, and then you included facial structure, right? For each and every one of those, I can point to a different group of people who would not be considered black, but would have one or more of those traits, right? So there's all this overlap, biologically speaking, right? In the biological world, there's all this overlap between these groups that are seen as being socially distinct, right? And there's also a lot of difference within those groups, right? So, for example, I was just watching the other day videos about this female bodybuilder, right? And she was doing these lifts that were crazy, you know, like I literally was like looking at them. I couldn't understand how bones just don't break under that sort of pressure, regardless of how much muscle you have. And I'm looking at her and I'm like, this woman is stronger than 99% of men in the world, right? There's no doubt about it. I would say comfortably 99% of the men in the world are not as physically strong as this woman, right? So there's all of this overlap, right? It's not to say that the majority of men aren't physically stronger than the majority of women, right? Of course they are. That's definitely the case. But there is all of this sort of overlap, right? And oftentimes as a society, we don't know how to process and deal with the people, right, who overlap, right? So for a long time, and I'd say even still today, we as a society oftentimes don't know how to handle really physically strong women, right? Men oftentimes will describe them as being things like too muscular, right? You know, and this often has to do with not only their ideas about what women are supposed to look like, but also their ideas about the relationships between men and women, right? This sort of kind of unspoken belief that a man is supposed to be physically stronger than the woman that he's partnered with, right? So these groups, right, defined by biology, cannot be perfectly reflected in cohesive and distinct biological categories, even though we take them as being socially distinct, right? So biological determinism then continues this work by taking biological indicators and using them to explain social behaviors. We're not just talking about biology used as a way to explain that there are these categories of women and men, but also biology used to explain why those categories do what they do, right? So biological essentialism refers to the idea that our essence, right, our core as individuals, our social essence, right, comes from our biology. So this could include our gender, our sex, our race, and other identities, right, that form kind of this sort of essence, right? So biological essentialism and biological determinism are very, very closely related, right? Biological essentialism says you are essentially female in this way that you just can't escape from, right? You know, or you are essentially male in this way that you can't escape from, right? And that the reason you act macho, or the reason that you act, you know, cute. What's like an opposite of macho? I don't have a good term for that. Like, what would you, if someone's like always like dainty, right? Right? That essentially is unavoidably is unavoidable because, right, biology determines these things. So they're very closely related, and we could use kind of this example of women being on their periods, which we've talked about already in this class, right? That women being on their periods, right, is seen is attached to all these sort of social meanings, right? That when a woman is on her period, essentially that becomes her essence, right? So this kind of biological thing that's connected to gender is seen as being like the essence of what defines a woman for that period of a couple days, right? I mean, it really is. Like, if you think about it, this is oftentimes used as just like a stand-in descriptor or explanation of all things related to your life for a period of days, right? People use it in offensive ways to explain your behavior, right? Like, if you happen to be angry when you're on your period, people will be like, oh, well, she's on her period, so, but that's like it. That's who you are, right? And historically, if you look at the Bible, if you look at most Western civilizations going back not that far, right? Women were actually literally like removed from society when they were on their periods, right? They essentially went into quarantine at home until their periods were over, right? Now, perhaps the best way of thinking about this historically is by looking at the term eugenics. Now, has anyone heard this term eugenics before? Yeah? In what context did you hear about it?
Genetically.
Okay, yeah. So eugenics, right, as we would define it in gender and women's studies, refers to various forms of bad science that were used to connect biology and social identity in harmful ways. So eugenics have been used, I don't want to get ahead to this, right? So using bad science, right? Science that scientists today would look back at and say, this isn't rigorous, this doesn't follow scientific disciplinary guidelines, right? You didn't even use the scientific method properly. Essentially using bad science to say, okay, well look, these social groups, right, blacks, Native Americans, these social groups behave in these particular ways actually because of their biology, right? And not because of social conditioning, not because of social construction, but because of their biology, right? And then this connected into a whole bunch of different bad things, because if we think back to this sort of knowledge-power nexus that we talked about at the beginning of this class, science, right, the fields of science, right, medical science, biological science, these fields are seen as being, again, a neutral arbiter of truth, right? Nobody thinks of science as being like politically charged, the way everybody says that gender and women's studies is a field of a bunch of people who are just trying to like force our politics down everybody's throat, right? Even though gender and women's studies has extremely rigorous disciplinary guidelines for how to conduct research, right, and all these sorts of things. But science is seen as being the sort of neutral arbiter of truth, right? And so because of that, the knowledge that comes out of the science industry is seen as being knowledge that we can act on, right? If science says this is the way it is, then we can act on this knowledge, right? And as long as the scientific knowledge compels us to do a particular thing, that is justified, it is just, it is ethical, it is moral, right? Because again, science is the source of truth, and if we can say that something is true with a capital T, right, then we can act on it in a particular way. So here's one easy example, right? Indigenous people, Native Americans, being lactose intolerant and therefore weak. This was something that was written about in the late 1800s and early 1900s, right? So scientists at the time period published a number of articles demonstrating that Native Americans were overwhelmingly lactose intolerant, right? And therefore had weaker bodies, right, than the strong, right, European bodies that had been coming there for the past 200 years. So people then thought to themselves, well, we're able to justify a number of social policies because we can actually point to the fact that we're dealing with a group of people who is physically, biologically inferior, right? Now, here's the thing. Lactose intolerant is what all human beings are by very nature of our birth, right? We're born lactose intolerant. The only reason we become lactose tolerant is because we feed our children so much dairy when they're young that their bodies start to produce high amounts of lactase, the enzyme that's needed to process lactose, right? And then eventually their bodies just adjust to those new baselines of lactase production and are able to continue to process the lactose that comes from milk. If anybody here has ever gone back and forth between veganism and vegetarianism, and I've done it a few times, like you notice right away the effects of milk on your body, right? And that your body isn't really supposed to have high amounts of lactose put into it, because evolution doesn't happen that quickly. And human beings never drank milk, more than 10,000 years ago, and even really much sooner than that after we domesticated cattle, right? So how did it work then with indigenous people in the United States? Well, Native Americans didn't domesticate cattle in the same ways that European settlers did, right? So they weren't drinking milk all the time. They weren't forcing their kids to become lactose tolerant, right? And therefore, this science came in and was like, well, they're lactose intolerant and they're weak, right? Their bodies are weak. Now, we know today that this is really, really bad science, right? Because we understand today where lactose intolerance comes from, and it is totally possible, I don't know, that back then we had no idea where lactose intolerance came from, right? However, this science is not, right, benign, right? There isn't an intent behind it, right? Which is to say that science isn't just this neutral arbiter of truth that exists outside of the realms of politics and culture and power, but that actually science is very actively involved in cultural determinations of gender by posing as being this neutral arbiter of truth. But as we know all too well, science has proven itself wrong over and over and over and over and over again, and continues to. And if you ask any scientist, like any real scientist, right, is science a perfect source of truth? They'll be like, no, we get stuff wrong all the time, right? Science isn't perfect. However, we oftentimes fail to realize that in the moment, right? Hindsight is 20/20. We can look back on all these things that we know now that we didn't know then. Now, another thing we might talk about is women's brain size, right? So, who here, I mean, everybody's heard this, that women have small brains, right? And therefore, such, and the other, right? Have people ever heard this about women having small brains, right? This was actually like a very rigorous thing in science, right? And scientists, if you can imagine, spent hours literally measuring the brains of corpses, right, over and over again to figure out, are men's and women's brains bigger, right? Now, I'm not interested in debating whether or not men's brains are on average bigger. I'm pretty sure they are, because men's skulls are on average bigger, and I don't think that's just thicker bones, right? However, where you take that and the meaning that you bring to it, how you use that to generate knowledge about men and women, is a different question. Are men's brains bigger than women's? I think potentially on average, yes. Does that mean men are smarter than women? Certainly not, right? But that's where this was taken, right? So science, right, and I put that in air quotes now, science, right, which was taken to be very serious and rigorous at the time, printed and published stuff about women's brain size, right? So that literally you would have, people who would be able to say, politicians, right, people in the media who would be able to say, well, listen, it's not me, I'm not biased against women. I love women, it's just science, right? This is kind of the logic of it. And this has been used in the U.S. during slavery. It's been used in the U.S. against indigenous people. It's been popular with imperial powers throughout Asia and Africa. And it was really, really popular with Hitler. Hitler paid a lot of scientists to essentially conduct false experiments to be able to justify their mistreatment, right, terrible mistreatment of Jews and other minority populations in Europe at the time, right? So this is this sort of ongoing practice. But thinking in terms of gender, what this means is, first off, that most people assume there's a dimorphic ideal, male and female, reflected in biology, right? So most people in the world, right, most people in the US, most people in Western culture still subscribe to biological determinist arguments about gender and about sex, right? They still really subscribe to this idea that on a biological level, we are just compelled and predetermined to be a certain way, right? But if we think about the social constructionist approach, right, and the way that kind of resonates with what we've all seen in our own lifetimes, it's kind of hard to really stand behind the biological approach. Like last week we talked about this idea of a tomboy, right? And a number of you said that you used to be a tomboy and identified, right? And did your gender in a more masculine way, right? But that has kind of disappeared over the lifetime. Now, if you subscribe to biological determinism, there would be no way to explain, A, how you acted more masculine when you were younger, and B, why that would have changed over the course of your lifetime. So this includes, in particular in relationship to gender, a dimorphic, right, or binary, right, approach to chromosomes, genitalia, and hormones. So let's talk about each of those really quickly. So when we're talking about a dimorphic, right, a binary, a black and white, one-and-one approach to chromosomes, what are we talking about?
X or Y.
Right, XX or XY, right? Who's familiar with these two sets, XX and XY, right? And they are for male and female, right? And when we talk about XX and XY, we oftentimes talk about it as though this is like one of the most crucially foundational elements of our biology, right? This is something that's determined really, really early in the lifespan, right? It's determined during sexual differentiation while in the uterus, right? It's determined while you're still a developing embryo, right? So this XXXY thing is seen as being really, really foundational to just humanness, right? Not just biologically, but then socially as it's used by biological determinists, right? Now, are XX and XY the only two chromosomal arrangements that exist? No. I'm just going to look at you whenever we're talking about anything biological. No, there's others, right? And you're going to read about that for this week, right? Of course, I'm going to talk at the end about the readings for this week. But you're going to read about that, and you're going to read about how there's kind of more than just two sets of chromosomes, right? Now, what about it when we talk about genitalia? What do I mean when I'm talking about a dimorphic biological basis for genitalia? Yep.
Either a penis or vagina, and then like individuals who are intersex, and especially infants who are born, like there's usually surgeries performed on them, obviously without their consent, like based on a scale,
Mm-hmm.
and then like they'll alter obviously the genitalia they were born with to fit either like what's considered male or female.
Exactly, right? And then what about when we talk about hormones? This one maybe is a bit easier. What is the dimorphic approach to hormones that folks would think of? I want to hear from other folks, yeah?
Testosterone and estrogen.
And estrogen, right? Testosterone and estrogen, right? That men have really, really high levels of testosterone and low levels of estrogen, right? And vice versa for women. Now, later on, we're going to talk about how each and every one of these three dimorphic biological approaches with chromosomes, genitalia, and hormones actually has no consistent biological basis within the scientific realm, right? So that even scientists don't debate whether or not there are more than two chromosomes, more than two genital arrangements, right? More than two kind of positions for hormone levels. And we can kind of think through this in relationship to biological determinism by thinking about estrogen and emotion, right? So, for example, a lot of people say that estrogen causes people to be more emotional, right? And that this is one of the reasons that women are more emotional. Again, right? It's not socially constructed. This approach assumes that it's biologically based. Now, in every sort of like lab test, right, in controlled settings around estrogen and testosterone levels and changing them with animals and even with humans, right, though estrogen and testosterone levels do have considerable bodily effects, right? Anyone who started taking testosterone, right, or started taking estrogen treatments while transitioning, right, anyone who's transgender and was transitioning using hormone treatments can tell you these changes do affect them, right? But science points to the fact that these changes affect people significantly more in social settings than in contained settings, right? In other words, that estrogen, right, and testosterone and hormones do have an effect on gender, right, but that they don't determine gender in the final instance because that's affected by social relations, right? So, for example, even though many people who start taking testosterone start to feel more aggressive, start to feel like they have more energy, right, scientists cannot, come to any sort of clear conclusion as to whether or not that is, and most scientists would agree that that's not caused solely by taking testosterone or taking estrogen, but also by the social meanings that are attached to the very act of taking testosterone and estrogen, right? So this is not unlike the placebo effect in medical science, where you think something is supposed to have an effect, so when you take that thing, it does have that effect, right? And this is kind of the way biology and social relations work together through or in relationship to gender, right? Again, we're not saying that biology doesn't play a role or that it's not important, but just that it doesn't determine gender, right, in the sort of final instance, right? So this biological approach maps onto sex, gender and sexuality, right? Such that not only like the very category of male, but also how a male is supposed to be sexually is oftentimes seen as being biologically determined, right? So, for example, has anybody ever heard like the evolutionary explanation of why women want to sleep with fewer people and men want to sleep with more people? Anybody over here heard it? Okay, yeah.
I thought it was because of, I think nursing children was very time consuming. So, I don't know, I'm trying to think. That it's to like, for a man, he's trying to like maximize his like reproductive potential, I guess. Whereas a woman is trying to, I think they call it the long-term, oh my God. What is it called now? A long-term mating strategy and a short-term mating strategy.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's you're kind of like dancing right around it. You're right on with it. So that's exactly what we're talking about. This explanation is that, well, the goal, right, the biological goal that like in our very loins we're motivated to reproduce, right? So for a guy, it makes sense to sleep with as many women as possible because what's the best way to have babies, right? It's just like, you know, expand your odds, right? And this is literally where the expression, right, sowing your oats comes from, right? This idea of literally going around, right, and just sleeping with as many people as possible, right? Now, for women, evolutionarily, people would say, right, you can only have one baby, right, at a time, or two or three if you have twins or triplets, right? So the goal was to find the best, strongest male mate, right? So your babies would be strong and have a good chance of survival, right? This is the evolutionary approach to understanding sex roles, right, between men and women. Now, is this a relevant approach nowadays? I mean, let me phrase it a different way. For the guys in the room, are you trying to have as many people with as many children with as many people as possible? Is that the long-term goal? No? Some people are thinking about it a bit. Okay, right. And for ladies, are you currently in the mindset of thinking to yourself, like, I really got to find, like, the perfect guy and, like, nail him down so I can have strong, like, 6'2" or taller babies that are going to survive infancy in this crazy harsh winters that we have here in Tucson, right? No, right? I mean, most people only have 2 kids anyways nowadays, right? This approach doesn't work anymore, which is to say that our biological pressures, right, have changed. However, evolutionary biology is still used to justify dating, right, and how dating works, right, as though, like, buying a woman dinner and insisting on paying, not just for the first date, but, like, for a big chunk of dates, right? Like, no matter how broke you are, you'll call your mom and be like, I know I'm 20, but I got a date, you know, and I really want to pay because gender, you know, determines how I behave in the final instance, right? You know, and you go there, and of course you pay for quite a few dates and you insist on it, right? There's nothing about our biology that's compelling us to do it, but we act as though like that's some sort of like, you know, when you see these videos that are like birds like doing like a dance for mating or something like that, or just like peacocks showing off their big feathers, you know what I mean? It's as though these social roles around dating and sex, right, and how we have sex and how we, do the hunt, right? They describe like men going on the hunt. Oh, I enjoy the hunt, right? Like this sort of thing. It's also sort of like evolutionary biology, as though we're on some sort of like BBC nature documentary, and it's like oh, you know, the rambunctious 19-year-old male, you know, found in his natural habitat, makes eyes at a fellow classmate, right? You know, this sort of thing, right? As though we're doing some sort of like dance to prove that I am like the strong lion that you want to take home, right? I'm your one strong male lion, and you are just one of my many female lions, right? That I'm trying to sow my wild oats in, right? And then how do we talk about women that, you know, do more than commit to just that one strong male figure? We talk about them in negative terms, right? And how do we talk about men who sleep with tons of women in mostly positive terms, right? And this all kind of relates back to the cultural power of things like science. Now, the field of medicine carries significant power in society, much of which is reflected through cultural practices. So things like medical breakthroughs are publicized in newspapers and magazines. Doctors are understood as kind of cultural figureheads and unquestioned experts, and medical science is used to justify social and political enterprises, right? So for example, if we think about the AIDS epidemic or cancer research, right? Medical science played a large role in popular culture and the popular culture around these subjects, right? And was really used to explore social concerns, like black and gay sexuality in the case of AIDS, right? Or like pollution or cosmetic uses in the case of cancer, right? So the way in which science and the medical industry talk about things, right, like AIDS, right, like cancer, is oftentimes done in a way that reflects prevailing social concerns of the time, right? So does anybody know what AIDS used to be called before it was called AIDS? So it used to be called GRIDS, gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome, right? This is in the late 80s or early to mid 80s when research was just being done, right? But there was a long time when scientists were convinced that this was something that only affected gay men, right? Now that's kind of tough because there's no scientific basis for that sort of assumption, right? There is no gene for sexuality. There's no gene that you can look at and say this person is going to be gay or this person is going to be straight. So scientists were really stooped. Now, does that mean that there weren't straight people with AIDS when it first broke out? Of course there were. But what was happening? They were showing up at doctors presenting all the same signs and symptoms, but because doctors had already determined in their head that this was something that only affected gay men, they would point them to other sorts of things. They would never make the connection and be like, you have AIDS, right? And a number of straight people died from AIDS because of the fact that doctors had already decided that this was something that only affected gay men. Now, why would they decide that with no scientific basis, right? Because there was none. This was just a conclusion that had been drawn through the selective perception of doctors who were looking at which patients came in, looking at what things they were reporting, right? So why would somebody be compelled to say, well, this is something that only affects gay men when there was no scientific basis for it? Because the medical industry and science are not separate from the social and cultural and political worlds, right? Which is to say that there were doctors who actually already had preconceived notions about the ethics or morality, right? Or perhaps even like, for them, what they might have described as being the disgustingness of gay sex, right? And we're already predisposed to map scientific discoveries onto those sorts of ethics and morals, right? So it became very, very easy to demonize, right, low-income communities and the gay community for having sex at the time period, right? And it was seen, and this happened extensively. People really demonized gay people for having sex, right, during this period in the 80s and into the early 90s until 94 when serious medical breakthroughs were found, right? So kind of our culture, right, and questions of ethics and morals, right, are oftentimes determined from the knowledge that emerges from science or that emerges from the medical industry, even though that is not perfect, right? Medical science is not perfect. It's always finding itself wrong, and it's free from it's not free from ethical or moral judgments, right? One second. So oftentimes it can be used to marginalize groups of people, marginalize social groups like women, people of color, trans people, gays and lesbians, and others. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is before or after it was generally accepted that anyone and everyone, not just the gay population, could have AIDS. But if it was before we realized that, do you know how the public cases of Magic Johnson and Eazy-E's diagnosis of AIDS were perceived by like the general public at the time?
So
Because those were
the
really big.
so for a large amount of the community, Magic Johnson, because Eazy-E's was like totally under wraps. It was really not talked about. There was a really short time frame between when Eazy was like, I'm sick, and when he passed away. We're talking about only a matter of a couple months. Now, my knowledge of that has entirely to do with the fact that I'm a hip-hop junkie and has nothing to do with the fact that I'm in gender and women's studies. But what you saw was with Magic Johnson, a huge awareness, particularly around the effects of HIV/AIDS in the low-income communities of color, particularly black communities, because AIDS really heavily affected low-income black communities and gay communities. Those were the two communities that it affected the most, right? But before Magic Johnson, there was an actor who, Let me see if I can. So Rock Hudson, right? So Rock Hudson was really one of the big ones. So he died in 1985, right? And Rock Hudson was this actor. He was a heartthrob actor. I mean, every sort of 1950s melodrama film, he was like the male sex symbol, right? Rugged, intense, right? Really, really popular. There's All That Heaven Allows. This film is like if you ever want to see just like a masterclass in 1950s melodrama film, All That Heaven Allows is a really great film. And Rock Hudson was a gay man. Nobody knew really that he was a gay man except for those who were close to him. And when it came out that he had AIDS, and then soon after when he was killed, that was the really big kind of popular culture turning point for a lot of people, right? Because Rock Hudson was, as far as most people knew, wealthy, powerful Hollywood elite. Yeah, I mean, he was older at this point, but still, right? So now to continue this, right, the mistreatment of trans individuals is oftentimes justified by people using biological arguments about sex and gender being two and only two and unchangeable, right? This is about a biologically determined binary, right, or a dimorphic biological determinist approach. So the mistreatment of trans individuals is often justified by people using biological arguments. So we saw this extensively when Barack Obama expanded protections to trans students in public schools. This wasn't too long ago. Do most folks remember about that? Right? And this is something that happened kind of somewhat in overlap with a lot of the attention we saw to what were called bathroom bills or trans bathroom bills about policing who can use what bathrooms where and when. So we're going to watch this little clip. Okay. So this is going to show a little clip from a news segment that he's going to talk about a bit ahead of time and afterwards. We're not going to watch the whole thing.
School board voted to allow trans students to go to the bathroom of their choice, and the federal government is now applying pressure to get these non-discrimination laws in place at a local level. So Fox News, of course, threw a tantrum over it.
This apparently is being compelled upon us by the Office of Civil Rights through the U.S. Department of Education under the the U.S. Department of Justice. And they're saying that Title IX, which was passed in 1972, somehow includes gender identity. And the notion that the federal government could reach into the 14,000 school districts across the United States of America and tell 90,000 school board members that you must comply or we're going to take away your federal education money is preposterous. That money is meant for the neediest children in our communities, for the hungriest children, for children with disabilities. And so is my federal government telling me that if I don't comply with whatever, this language or any other language, that I have to comply with their language or they're going to take away our children's lunch money?
Isn't it really weird that a school, which is supposed to be rooted in science and the scientific method, is teaching now that there is no difference between men and women, that you can change your sex, when of course that's contrary to basic biology?
Well, certainly that's what you heard in the meeting, and it was funny because I just only heard the audio, and you would think from the applause that they were cheering by the fact that that motion passed, but they were cheering the single vote that tried to echo a parent's voice, and that was what was missing here, is, these are public schools for the public's benefit with public dollars. And we seem to say to parents, we want your tax dollars to run our schools. We want you to join PTAs. We want you to be involved and volunteer. We want you to fundraise. And then we want you to go away, because anything having to do with policy or rigor of curriculum or something like this that has very much to do with personal privacy and dignity of all students and all parents is not something we want your comments on.
The left's war on biology continues. It's a weird moment in America. It's really nice to talk to you this morning.
The left's war on biology continues. Yes. It's the left which is so fundamentally anti-science. It's us that has all the climate change deniers and all of the creationists. anything that they accuse liberals of doing is what they do, essentially.
Now, ignore this
I mean, we've seen this
politicization of it
argument time and time
onto
again
parties,
in
right?
different forms.
Listen to
So
what
much
he's
so
about to say
gay
next.
marriage, for example. You know, we are not the bigots for being against gay people and wanting to take away their rights. You're the bigots for not accepting us being bigots. It's at the point where it's just not creative anymore. You just look dumb when you use these arguments. Everything you just try to flip it. I know what you are, but what am I? You're somebody who just copied our argument, which is true, and flipped it on its head and tried to blame us of it. That's what you are. It's so easy to see what you're doing. I love some of Tucker's quotes there, though. Trans people using the bathrooms of their choice is, quote, contrary to basic biology. Oh, is it? No, see, Tucker, some people are male and they're born male in every way. Some people are female and they're born female in every way. Some people are born male and they have essentially a female's brain. It's a male exterior, but you're a female inside and you know you're a female, and vice versa. So acknowledging that fact of reality, what do you want to do if somebody's a transgender person and they went through all the things, they got the hormone replacement treatment, they got a sex change, and they went through everything because they know who they really are. So now the person who was a man is now a woman, right? What do you want that person to do? You want to go up to them and I, Tucker Carlson, will tell you what bathroom you can use because it's my right to tell you what bathroom you can use? Fuck off, son! Who are you? Who are you? Here's my...
I didn't intentionally wait until he cursed, but it ends up being what it is. All right, so let's try answering some of these questions as a class. Let's start with this first one. So how do you see biology brought up in the film? When do you see biology brought up? By who? How? Yeah? Okay, that you're saying that biology determines gender. Okay, yeah. Other folks, yeah?
The people who were like against the transgender bathrooms were using the term like basic biology, so they were thinking more like just the two genders, so like they like refer to it as basic.
Yeah, and it's still taught like in so many biology classes that way, right? Even though like modern science knows about all these exceptions to these dimorphic sort of approaches or binary approaches, yeah? Yeah?
I was going to say, like, it's brought up biology more as like a guideline and not, well, it just brought up as a guideline, really, of what is allowed to happen.
Right. So again, biology and science, right, get this position as being like this neutral arbiter of truth, right? That biology isn't itself subject to ethical and moral judgments about gender. Biology is just this neutral, right, objective portrayal of the natural world as it is, right? Now, who's portrayed as the victims in this film by different people? Yeah?
Are you talking about the Fox report?
Anybody, because there's a number of people that are portrayed as victims, depending on who's speaking.
I know the Fox report was, they were trying to like kind of pull the argument away from what was actually happening, saying that like federal funding, they were forcing everyone who worked in the schools to accept it, or else to accept the change, or else they won't be supported by the government anymore. And two, if they didn't support what the government put out, then the government was gonna take away money, which would in turn hurt kids in lower income.
Right. So the kids are the victims. By that first woman talking, the kids are the victims, right? And who else? She had another set of victims, yeah?
The parents who was saying that because the parents don't get to decide that they're the victims,
Uh-huh.
the parents don't get to decide the curriculum.
Yeah, exactly, right. And now for the pundit podcast guy who's putting this whole thing on, who are the victims as far as he sees it? Yeah? Okay, yeah, exactly. Gender non-binary people, trans people, gender queer, gender fluid people, exactly, right? And then in what ways here is biological? Well, I think we kind of tackled this question, right? That in this clip we really see that biology is connected with truth, right? Now, nobody really ever asks the so what question, right? Now, a lot of us do sometimes, but like if let's say there's a whole group of people that are like, no, sex is this biological binary thing. There's male and female, and there's nothing but that. And if somebody wants to change their sex from male to female or female to male, right, that's denying science, right? So let's say, right, let's just entertain that there's nothing scientific, right, about trans identity, right, which is not at all the case, right? Science doesn't say that. Social sciences, humanities don't say that. But let's just entertain, right, as though we're having a discussion with someone who insists that sex is biologically determined. Let's just entertain that it is, and that we still have people who want to change their sex, right? So what, right? This is like a good question to ask, right? This could be a question that we could have asked about same-sex marriage. This question of kind of like, does it really affect you, right? And the way you perceive its potential effect, right, might be affected, right, by the very way that you feel about these particular groups of people, right? So when we think about then how this all maps onto kind of trans issues, right, there is a way in which this biological determinist approach is used to justify the social mistreatment of trans individuals, right? And again, you would hear the same sort of line from a lot of these folks who support, right, these sort of biological determinist approaches to sex and gender. You would hear them say, listen, I don't hate trans people. It's just science, right? So again, science gets kind of put into this position as being the neutral arbiter of truth, and anything that's true, right, can't be unethical, can't be immoral, because it's science, right? This is the way that it's kind of talked about and justified, yeah.
In that same way, I think like in the DSM, like homosexuality was treated as a mental illness, and like people use that sort of argument to like categorize trans people as mentally ill, and then they use like science to back it up, because like I mean the DSM is like this like psychology.
Yeah, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, right? And it's the official book that determines what qualifies as a psychological or psychiatric disorder and what doesn't, and what the symptoms are and what the course of treatment is, right? And it wasn't until 1973 that gay was taken out, like that homosexuality was taken out of the DSM. And a lot of people consider that to be actually very early in the grand scheme of things, right? But gender dysphoria is still listed in the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual, right? However, vast majority of psychologists and psychiatrists, right, have been saying for years that gender dysphoria is not a valid psychological thing, and that it's actually something that's caused by society, right, putting pressure and not being able to accommodate, right, trans individuals, right, that leads to gender dysphoria, not through some sort of like medicalized, biologically determined psychological thing, right? So. Now, again, to kind of recap, biological determinism depends on a number of assumptions, right? So first off,
Sorry.
no, don't worry. It depends on the assumption that there's a dimorphic ideal, male and female, reflected in biology, right? It includes the assumption that there's a dimorphic basis for chromosomes, right? XX and XY. There's a dimorphic basis for genitalia, right? Penis and scrotum or vagina, right? And that there's a dimorphic basis for hormones as well, talking about two very distinct sets of levels of estrogen and testosterone, right? And then most assume that the traits that are different between men and women, right, the social traits that are different between them have a biological basis, right, which then maps onto sex, gender, and sexuality. However, we can take apart each of these items on its own terms, right? So biological sciences, first off, refute dimorphic ideals in all three determinants of sex and gender. So with hormones, right, scientists show and demonstrate all the time how the amount of variation in hormone levels between and within groups of men and women is much more vast than we would assume, right? That the variance in estrogen levels in men is much more vast than we would assume, that the variance in testosterone levels of women is much more vast than we would assume. So the idea that like all women have more estrogen and less testosterone and all men have more testosterone and less estrogen isn't really biologically valid, doesn't really reflect the diversity of hormone levels that people have, right? Then the same thing was done with chromosomes, right? So XXY, or XX and XY, right? It's been demonstrated there's a whole other range of combinations, XXY and others, right, that lead to different presentation of sex genitalia, right? And then again with genitalia, we don't have a perfect dimorphic ideal, right? Instead, you have kind of like a very, very large spectrum of variants that you will learn about when you look at the articles that have to do with intersex, right? And intersex individuals. Now, scientific work further clarifies the role of biology for us in determining social traits, right? So first off, very little, if anything, is determined solely by biology, right? Now, biology, however, does have a really strong influence on how we interpret social identities and how we embody those identities, right? However, biological determinism ignores human choice, right? And in so doing, it ignores how human choice is determined by socialization. Again, we're thinking here of the path of least resistance, right? So biological determinism, right, in its desire to describe women's, what was the word we used? When I was like, hee, like, the sort of thing. So biological determinism seeks to explain, right, women's daintiness through biology. It ignores the way how from a very young age, women are told that the path of least resistance is to be dainty, right? That'll gain them the most social respect, right? The least amount of mistreatment, right? However, biology is used to explain that, right? Again, it does play a role, but it's not the sole determining factor. It's just one of a range of factors which, along with socialization and social construction, plays a role, right? So therefore, we might conclude that biological determinism only appears, right, to be true, since it's used to justify the continued socialization of young people into those roles of male or female, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are born, we tell them, here's how you can be, here's the right way to be. That's what we talked about for the last 2 weeks, right? And then they choose to be that way, right? They're socialized to be that way because it's the path of least resistance. Yet we turn around, right? Even as we're actively socializing our children, even as we're actively correcting our children's behaviors and saying, no, act like a man, no, you need to be more girly. Even as we're actively doing that, right, actively participating in social construction, we turn around and we say, oh no, actually, this is all biology, right? So we're going to watch another little clip here before talking about, I'll watch this for a few minutes and I'm going to talk about the readings. So before we watch this clip, I want you to be thinking about these questions. So first off, how does the speaker define biological determinism, right, to help kind of reiterate that definition? How does he define biological essentialism, right? Again, to reiterate that definition. Now, how does he define the role of biology in influencing our traits and behaviors? How does he define intersex? And then finally, in his discussion, how can we understand the category, right, of intersex as challenging dimorphic, biologically determinist approaches to gender?
Suggest ways that they could be better, or are overlooking something, or are making a weak argument. So, last week we talked about categories. Some gender communication research focuses on categories of male and female. And we also looked at the influence of feminist research in theory and politics, which was organized into categories of proto-feminism, first wave, second wave, third wave, post-feminism, and transversal feminism. Now remember that these categories are loose tools to understand an intellectual and political history. They tend to oversimplify things a little bit, and there's actually a lot of overlap and interaction between different categories of feminisms. Now, one of the influence of feminism was focusing on categories of gender as distinct from categories of biological sex. Male and female were categories related to physical genitalia. Masculine and feminine were categories of behavior, actions, attitudes, and appearances that are associated with biological sex, but not the same thing as male or female. Another subcategory that we'll talk more about is a subset of gender, sexuality. Categories such as heterosexual and homosexual refer to a type of behavior. What what biological sex a person falls in love with and is attracted to are the categories of sexuality. Now, biological determinism is the idea that your body determines everything about you. Your biological sex that you were born with determines how you should act in terms of gender, including what sort of people you should be attracted to in your romance and your sexuality. Biological determinism is also known as biological essentialism, the idea that your essence, the core of who you are, is determined by your biology, by your body. Now, this is where I have to say that questioning biological essentialism, questioning and challenging biological determinism, is not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not saying that we don't have bodies. It's not saying that there are no biological or genetic differences between men and women, or between the rest of us, or between us and big fluffy cats that like to jump down across my desk. Challenging biological essentialism is just to say that biology in your body is not the entire story. It's not 100% of who you are. It's not carved in stone. It's a combination of your body, your biology, society, culture, maybe your soul or your spirit or your inner essence, or things that we don't even fully understand. There's a huge variety of factors that go into making us who we are and making people the way we are. What we're looking at this week and yesterday and today are challenges to the notion that it's all about biology, that biology determines everything. Okay, well, now that we've got these basic categories down, of biological, sex, gender, and sexuality, things are going to start getting more complicated. And complicated in ways that challenge these ideas of biological determinism and biological essentialism. Yesterday, you saw the British documentary Me, My Sex, and I, which was about intersexuality. Intersexuality, which occurs in humans and all other animals, refers to a variety of conditions in which there is a variation in sex characteristics, including chromosomes, gonads, or genitals, that doesn't allow for an individual to be distinctly identified as male or female. You may have heard of the term hermaphrodite to refer to such people, but this is an outdated term and it's not really used very much anymore. And actually, intersex people don't really like it and kind of find it offensive for a variety of reasons. So intersex is how we refer to these people. Now, intersexuality reveals that even the categories of biological sex, male and female, are not wrong, but not as perfect as we like to think. The categories are not mutually exclusive. That is, there are some people who fall in both categories, to some degree. There are disagreements among medical and governmental organizations about the exact definition of intersexuality, so it's hard to make a precise estimate of how many people out there are intersex. Current estimates range from 0.1% to 1.8% of live births. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that would mean that almost 11,000 individuals are born each day in the United States. Okay, hold on, I got my tongue tied there. Okay, current estimates range that between 0.1% and 1.8% of live births are intersex. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, almost 11,000 individuals are born each day in the United States. So, that would mean that somewhere between 11 and 200 intersex persons are born in the United States every day.
All right, so we're going to pick up a lot of these questions when we have our discussion on Thursday. But before everybody packs up, if you all could hold off, I want to talk real quick about the readings. So we have 2 readings for this week. They're both in the book. Okay, so when everybody comes on Thursday, I expect everybody to have their book with them. So the first one is The 5 Sexes Revisited by Fausto-Sterling. Now, Fausto-Sterling is writing this as a follow-up piece to an older piece of hers, as new information about intersex births was known, and she wanted to improve upon some of her first piece. Now, in the first piece, she had suggested an approach to biological sex that instead of having 2 positions, had 5 positions. thus the term the five sexes, and thus the term the five sexes revisited for this paper as she's coming back to reflect on it. Now, in this piece, she's essentially demonstrating how biological science shows that the complexity of sex and gender determination is too much to categorize in any way, even with a five-sex system instead of a two-sex system. And this piece covers a lot of the biological arguments about gender that address this sort of dimorphic approach to biological determinism. So some questions for you all to answer as you're reading that is, how has the author's thinking changed since the first piece that they wrote? How does this author feel about biological determinism? And then also, what do you think about the author's suggestions at the end of the piece? Now, the next piece, Doing Gender, Determining Gender, Transgender People, Gender Panics, and the Maintenance of the Sex-Gender Sexuality System by Laurel Westbrook and Kristen Schilt, discusses what they term gender determination, which refers to where your gender is authenticated in various instances, like government forms or in social interactions. Now, they contrast the biology-based approach and identity-based approach to gender determination. And you want to pay a lot of attention to the way they define and talk about these two different approaches, biology-based and identity-based. Now, the authors track three instances of gender determination in the piece. One is through federal and state proposals prohibiting gender-based discrimination. Next was in a proposal to remove the genital sex change surgery requirement to change your sex in New York City. And then the third is about controversies over trans people in sports. Now, the questions for this reading you want to try and answer are, do the authors prefer biological or identity-based approaches to gender? You can probably already assume which one it is, given the nature of this class. What are the limits of either approach? And who gets mistreated by biological determinism, and how? So you want to be ready to answer those questions. Again, we're also going to be having a writing seminar on how to write reading reflections on Thursday, too.